In this code quickie, I'll be showing you how to make a lightweight and easy to use form validation class. You may ask yourself why you'd create a class or why when there are many others already. This is simply because you'll save time validating forms and you'll know the ins and outs of your class and you will find it easier to use. However, there are some disadvantages. The code is error prone, there could be exploitation of the code, and there is no real community support. So in this video we'll be looking at a basic example. We'll be using a registration form. So let's get started. First, let's create the class. Next, we'll create the construct function. We're using a construct function to define the form ID and which variable to use, either _post or _get. We're using a form ID as it allows for multiple forms to be submitted to the same page and use the respective validation functions. The next function will be the value function. The arguments will be name and sanitize with a default value of true. The name argument will be for the respective import, and if sanitize is truly, the function will return the input value with the characters replaced with the respective HTML entities, else the raw input value. The reason sanitize is true by default is to prevent XSS. Programmers may be smart but can be forgetful, and there is no harm done if we replace the special characters. So if the name key is present in the post variable, we'll return the value, else whatever the weather will return an empty string. We'll test this function out by providing value attributes to the username and email inputs, with the values being the return from the value function. This is particularly useful as it prevents user frustration. If there is an error in the form, they simply fix the invalid input without re-entering provider data. So let's create our first instance of the class. With the new input, the name is form ID, as the form ID name is form ID. The value is register, as the form ID is register. So value equals register value username. Let's do the same for email. So let's try this out. Code quickie. That is successful. The next function is submitted. It returns either true or false depending on whether the respective form has been submitted. The submitted function will be used internally, however may be useful elsewhere, so will be public. The if statement will require two true evaluations. The first is that the post array has values, and the second, the value of the import with the name form ID matches the respective class. If so, we'll return true, else we'll return false. So now the most important function, validate. Validate has one argument and is expected to be an array. The array must be an associative array, with the keys being names for the inputs requiring validation, and the values for each key being a function to evaluate whether there is an error and return it. Firstly, we need to check whether the form has been submitted before evaluating whether there are errors. If the form has not been submitted, we'll return this. We use for each to loop through the array. Within the loop, we will create an error variable. We will call the validation function with the arguments being the raw value of the input, hence the argument false. And secondly, this. The significance of the second argument will be explained further on. If the error variable is a string, meaning there's an error, we will set the key to a private error variable for this class. The next function is error. This has one argument of name which will be used for the respective input. This function will simply return an error for the input if there is one, else an empty string. So let's test it out so far. So now we need to create the validation functions. So username if empty value return. So if the values for username and email are empty, this will return the respective errors. With email, however, can be provided incorrectly. Here's where the second argument of this comes in significance. So let's test this out. The next function will be addError. It has two arguments, the first being the name of the input, which is an error, and the second, what is expected to be a string giving an explanation of the error. This function can be used to add an error for an input with a name after evaluation in a separate validation function. The next function is errorInForm. This returns true or false depending on whether there is an error for the form. This is evaluated depending on whether the private error variable is empty. The final function is success. This returns true or false. This will evaluate the form has been submitted and that there are no errors in the form.